In the last part of the book of Judges, we're in the book of Judges. Judges is about a 300-year period of Jewish history. Leading up to, after the book of Judges, we get into the kingships. 1 Samuel is when Saul, when Israel finally tells God, we no longer want you to be our God. And make no mistake, that's what they say. We don't want you to be our king. We want a king like all the other nations. And so they ask Samuel to give them a king, and God responds to Samuel, and he raises up Saul of the tribe of Benjamin. That happens immediately after this 300-year period of the book of Judges. We're in this period when God is the king. There is no king in Israel by God's design. God is the king of Israel, and from time to time, Israel will walk away from God. They'll turn to idolatry, not from time to time. This is their pattern. They turn to idolatry, and when they turn to the false gods and worship the false gods, Baal and Ashtoreth, specifically here in Judges, when they turn to the false gods, God will, in punishment to Israel, He'll bring a foreign nation against Israel, and they will oppress Israel in God's discipline. Finally, after a period of years, Israel will get the picture. We've turned away from God. We need to cry out to Yahweh, the God, the one true God, the only God. And Israel will cry out to Yahweh, and Yahweh will raise up a judge. And that's what we're talking about in the book of Judges, this series of judges that God raises up to cast off that foreign oppression and to let Israel have her peace and her freedom again. The sad thing is that you would think that that would only have to happen once. But over and over in the book of Judges, we see this cycle where God will deliver Israel, and Israel will again rise up in her idolatry, turn away from God again, worship things that don't exist, these false gods, and God will again punish them, and Israel will again cry out to God. And we see this cycle 6 major times in the book of Judges. They just don't learn. And so what we're going to see from here on out in the book of Judges is at the end of these judgeships, not only is there foreign oppressors that come in to oppress Israel, but we're going to see Jew on Jew violence. It's a nation eating itself. Reminds me much of our nation, eating itself, destroying itself from within. So we see this Israelite on Israelite violence from here to the end of the book of Judges. In Gideon, when we saw in Judges 6, 7, and 8, this man named Gideon who was raised up as a judge, Gideon's judgeship ended in Jew against Jew violence. Remember Gideon's son, Abimelech? He killed 70 of his own brothers. That's Jew against Jew violence. At the end of Jephthah's judgment, we're going to see, and he's the judge in this section here, Judges 10, 11, and 12. At the end of his judgeship, we're going to see Jew on Jew violence. The nation is destroying itself. If God doesn't step in, the nation Israel would have destroyed itself. They would have imploded from the inside. So his judgeship will end in a civil war that you can read about in Judges 12, 1 through 6. We'll get here. Samson's judgeship, the last judge in the book of Judges, will end in civil war. In Judges chapter 17, 18, 19, 20, and 21, we see Israelite on Israelite violence. Jew turning against Jew. Tribesmen killing tribesmen. But this time, after Samson's judgeship, there will be no period of peace. Remember, after all the other judges, after Gideon and Israel had peace for 40 years, after this judge and Israel had peace for 20 years or whatever, at the end of Samson's judgeship, you don't have that phrase, you don't read that again, that Israel has peace for this many years. What you read at the end of Samson's judgeship is Israel is tired of all the judges, and that's when they tell Samuel, we want a king. We no longer want Yahweh to be our king. We want a king on earth. We want to lead. We want a man to lead, and we want to follow a man, and God will raise up Saul. So the book of Judges will end in utter chaos. It ends in utter chaos. The history of Israel. And the book of this 300-year period is just a cycling down. It gets worse and worse and worse for Israel. The very last statement in the book of Judges is this. It says, this is the very last verse. The very last truth that God teaches in the book of Judges is this right here. There was no king in Israel in those days, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. What do you call that? Everyone doing what's right in his own eyes. Everyone having a say. You call that democracy. You call that democracy. But it was a disaster. Always has been a disaster. It's never worked. A true democracy. We're not a democracy, by the way. We're a representative republic. Well, I won't go there. But in Israel, there was no king. And you say, but I thought God didn't want there to be a king. Yes, but the only reason God didn't want there to be a king is because God was king. It's because Yahweh was the king. And when you get to 1 Samuel, you see that when Samuel says, Lord, they've rejected me. And God says, don't worry about it, Samuel. It's not you. It's me they've rejected. It's me they don't want to be their king. It's me they've turned against. It's not you. So there was no king in Israel means that they had also rejected Yahweh, the one true God, as their king. They refused to follow anyone, deity or human. And so they call out for a human king. They didn't want any judges anymore. They wanted to be led by a king, as if that would solve all their problems. Which is the irony to me, that having a human king or a human president is supposed to solve all a nation's problems. Let me ask you. We have an election in a couple of years, next year, isn't it? We're in 2023 now. Whoever we elect, is that going to solve all of America's problems? No is the answer. It could go a long way to fix some things, but solving America's problem is going to take a relationship with God, because America's problem is spiritual. It's not physical, it's not monetary, it's spiritual. We have done what Israel did. We have turned away from the worship and the leadership of the one true God. And so our country is on the road to end in chaos. I hate to say that, but the path that we are on leads to anarchy and chaos. That's our path. The further you turn from God, the darker it gets. And we are in the midst of Judges here, and you read, but Rick, how does this Old Testament, how does this have anything to do with what we're living through today? I hope what I just said paints a little bit of a picture of the fact that this history of Judges is very important to our today. We're doing exactly what Israel did. We're walking away from the blessings of the one true God. We're taking him out of our classrooms. We're taking him out of our courtrooms. We're trying to erase God. Not we, not Gulf Coast Bible Church, not believers, biblical believers in this land, but the bulk of this country is trying to erase God from our public heritage. Wipe him out as if he never existed. That's what Israel did, as Yahweh is about to tell them. In Judges chapter 10, make no mistake, even though Israel is doing everything they can to bury themselves, Yahweh won't allow it. Despite everything, and as far as Israel goes away from Yahweh, the one true God, I call him Yahweh because he calls himself Yahweh in the Bible. You say, why is this pastor using this word Yahweh? Because in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, God introduces himself to Moses in the burning bush as Ehyeh, I am. God looks down to earth and he says, I am to mankind. I'm the self-existing and ever-existing one. I am. Man looks back up to God and says, Yahweh, you are. He is the ever-existent one. That's where we get this word Yahweh from. The Hebrew for the name that God gave himself to Moses. So in Judges chapter 10, it says, now after Abimelech died, this was Gideon's son, We see two judgeships, very short, two men, Tola and Yair. We see their judgeships. And it says, after Avimelech died, Tola, the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, good names for dogs there, a man of Issachar. A man of Issachar. Remember where Issachar is, just quickly. Look at it right here. When Joshua came across the Jordan River with Israel, he divided up the land, and this is where the Israelites live. Here's the Jordan River right here. Everything on the east side, Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, this is called the Transjordan. This is not the land of Canaan. This is not the promised land. The promised land is west of the Jordan, all of this. And so what name did we just come across? Issachar. So this is happening in the promised land, in the land of Issachar, the red there. That's when Tola, or where Tola is from. He's a man of Issachar, and he arose to save Israel, and he lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. Ephraim is down here. So this is where he was born and raised. This is who he is. Why he's an Ephraim, good question. I don't know the answer. God doesn't give it to us. Because they were supposed to remain in their tribal inheritances. So why this man lives further south, we're not told. But the fact of the matter is, look in verse 2, God has raised this man up, Tola, and it says he judged Israel 23 years, and then he died and was buried in Shamir. So we see a judge raised up by Yahweh here, but what we don't see is what? A foreign enemy. It doesn't say God gave them over to the Philistines, or God gave them over to the Midianites or the sons of Ammon or whoever. We don't see a foreign enemy. My question is, did God have to raise up a judge to settle internal Jew against Jew disputes that were destroying the nation? It's exactly what he did. Remember what Avimelech did. He killed his 70 brothers, the sons of Gideon. They were destroying themselves. Israel was in this self-destruction mode. God has to raise up a judge just to bring order and stability in Israel, because Israel is self-imploding. Israel has abandoned Yahweh, but Yahweh, as I've said and as we'll see, is not abandoning Israel. Now, what's the answer to the question why? Why won't Yahweh just abandon these idolatrous, stiff-necked, stubborn Jews? Why won't He walk? Why won't He just let them be destroyed like He told Moses? Step aside, I'll destroy all these people, Moses, and I'll start over a new nation with you. Why won't God do that? Why? Because He made a promise. God won't turn against Israel because He made a promise to Abraham. God promised Adam in the garden that the seed of the woman would one day come and deliver man from their sins. In Genesis chapter 12, we get to a man named Abraham, the first Jew, and God says, it's through the Jewish man Abraham, it's through his people that I will save the earth, a Jew named Jesus of Nazareth, born 2,000 years later. Why doesn't God do away with Israel when Israel turns their back on God? It's because God keeps His promises. That's why. Because He's a trustworthy and reliable God. He's made a promise to Israel, and regardless of how unfaithful a wife they are to Him, He'll never change His promise. He will always keep His promise. So Israel definitely abandons the worship of Yahweh, but Yahweh doesn't abandon His people. Not forever. So this Tola, this first judge, seems to have had an orderly and stable judgeship for 23 years in Israel. He's keeping the nation from completely disassembling, from completely destroying itself. In verse 3 it says, after him, another judge. God brings up another judge. What do we not see? A foreign threat. Why does there need to be a judge here? It's because Israel is so far in depravity that just to keep the Jews from destroying themselves, God has to raise up a judge, so He does. This man, Yair, the Gileadite. Now Gilead, it says that after him Yair the Gileadite arose and judged Israel 22 years. Interesting that this judge, the Gileadite, is east of the Jordan River over here. So not only is God protecting Israel inside the confines of the promised land, the land he promised them, he's also protecting them over here in this region, which is known as Gilead. So east of the Jordan, he raises up this guy, Yair, to settle Israel, to stabilize Israel. And so for 22 years he does. Verse 4 tells us a little bit about this man. It says he had 30 sons who rode on 30 donkeys. He was wealthy. He was a wealthy man living like a king. To have 30 sons means you have multiple wives. I've never known a woman who could birth 30 kids. There's not enough lifespan to birth 30 children. So he was living like a king with his multiple wives and his multiple sons. Look what else he says about it. Not only did he have 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys, I say he was wealthy because the donkey wasn't easily come by, whatever the word is in those days. Only the wealthy had donkeys. They had 30 cities in the land of Gilead. So all around this land east of the Jordan River, he's got an empire of cities. He's got cities everywhere. He's got 30 sons, 30 cities who are riding on 30 donkeys. This man is living like a king. They weren't all perfect. He was living like a king, more like a pagan than a Jewish judge. 30 cities in the land of Gilead that are called Havot Yair to this day. Havot is the word for cities, so this is the cities of Yair. He named this grouping of 30 cities after himself, like a king would. And verse 5 says, Yair died and was buried in Kamon. So for how many years was it? For 22 years, God allowed there to be a stability. Even though this king wasn't perfect, or this judge, God allowed a stability, an order to be brought into Israel. They were killing themselves. They were destroying themselves in their idolatry. They were offering up their children to the god Molech in fire, in false worship of God. I mean, Israel was in self-destruct mode. I can't say that loudly enough. Notice again here that there's nothing said about Israel turning back to Yahweh and worshiping Him. It's just grace. The judgeship of Tolah to keep Israel orderly was God's grace. The judgeship of Yair to keep Israel orderly and stable was just God's grace. You don't read anything about them realizing they're in horrible idolatry and turning back to Yahweh. Nothing is stated about Israel turning away from idolatrous relationships with the false gods that they're worshiping. What is indicated here is the faithfulness of Yahweh. He made promises. He'll never back away from a promise. The promise to Israel and to this group of Jews in particular was in Judges chapter 2 verse 1 when he said, I will never break my covenant with you. You wonder, why doesn't God turn away from such an idolatrous people? Why doesn't God pull the cord? I mean, couldn't He? He's Creator God. He rules sovereignly over all of the world. Could He have given this up and said, okay, I'm going to start with a different people, a people not as stiff-necked and stubborn, except for His promise to Israel? He could have. But in Judges 2 verse 1, it says, the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and this is what God, the angel of God, Jesus Christ, pre-incarnate, don't have time to go into that, but that's who this is. It's the Son of God. He comes and tells Israel, I brought you out of Egypt. I led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, here's the promise, I will never break my covenant with you. That's why He's a long-suffering God. That's why He's patient when Israel does what they do. He disciplines them for sure. But He'll never break His covenant with Israel. Look what it says in the next verse. And as for you, what's Israel's response? Yahweh says, I'll never break my covenant with you. I will be your God. You will be my people. How does Israel respond? God says, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of the land. Your covenant is with me. The contract, the agreement, I will be your God and you will be my people on earth. That contract, that covenant is with Yahweh. So he tells them, don't make a covenant with anybody, any of the inhabitants of the land, or any of their gods. Instead of making a covenant with them, you shall tear down their altars, tear down their worship sites. But what do? God tells Israel, because he knows all things, but you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Their idolatry. He's a God who keeps his promises. Look at this. This is probably, if I had to choose a favorite verse in the Bible, this is probably it, believe it or not. This is probably my favorite few words that God tells us about himself in the Bible. He says, I, Yahweh, when you see the word Lord in all capital letters, that's the word Yahweh. He says, for I, Yahweh, do not change. And everything I am, I hang on that hook, that I have an unchanging God, that the promises he's made, believe and be saved, that this mortal will one day put on immortal, that the church will be raptured before the tribulation, that one day Jesus will rule on this earth for 1,000 years. All the promises he's made to us, that he's made to me, I hang on this verse. Because if we had a God who could change, if his promises weren't stable, unchangeable, then there's no value in the promise. And really there's no value in the God at the end of the day. But the fact that he is unchanging and stable means everything to me. And look what he says to Israel in Malachi chapter 3, verse 6. He said, for I, Yahweh, do not change. And because I don't change, and because I am a God who keeps his promises, you, Israel, you sons of Jacob, are not consumed. I would destroy you otherwise. But because I'm a God who makes promises and has promised your father Abraham that all the nations of the world would be blessed through his seed, the one who would come named Jesus. Because of a promise to humanity I made that I would send a deliverer to deliver Adam's race. Because of those promises and my love for the world, it's because of my promises and my unchangeable character that I don't destroy you. What a thing to hear. You'd love to hear the first part. He puts his arm around you and he says, for I, Yahweh, do not change. And you say, oh, praise you, God. And while he's got his arm around you, he says, and it's because of that I don't destroy you, son. He goes on. Look at the next verse. Why would you say, but Lord, why would you have reason to destroy Israel? Look what he says in the very next verse in Malachi 3:7. From the days of your fathers you have turned aside from my statutes and have not kept them. You haven't obeyed me one time. What was the very first statute, the first commandment? What is the first commandment, the 10 commandments that Israel was supposed to obey? I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. You failed at number 1. Because you do have other gods in my midst, Baal and Ashtoreth and all these false gods of the Canaan paganite nations. From the days of your fathers, God tells the sons of Jacob, Israel, from the days of your fathers all the way back into the book of Judges where we are, you've turned aside from what I told you to do. You've not kept my statutes. Return to me, he says, always this invitation from God. Return to me. It's never too late with this God. If you're still breathing air, friend, if you're still breathing air, it's not too late. God says, return to me and I will return to you, says Yahweh of hosts. But you say, Israel responds to God, how shall we return? God always the Father with his arms outstretched, waiting for his Son to come back. Always offering that restoration, reconciliation of relationship. But Israel doesn't want it. Israel didn't want it. Israel doesn't want it. So Yahweh made a promise and he cannot change his oath. He says, I do not change. So once God makes a promise, it's set in stone and it cannot change. So why is Israel, after all their idolatry, why is Israel continue to be protected and covered over by Yahweh? Because He made a promise to you and me that He would save the world through the man Jesus Christ. That's why. That's exactly why. He made a promise to the human race that He would save the world, that He would save us from our sins, that He would make a way for us to go to heaven through this Jewish man named Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God who became man. If not for God being a God who doesn't change, can you see the problem? But He doesn't change. In chapter 10, verse 6, back in the book of Judges, we see the cycle, the complete cycle of the book of Judges will begin again. In Tola and Yair, these two judges, we don't see the whole cycle, the 4 steps of the cycle. But in verse 6 all the way to chapter 12, verse 15, so from 10:6 to chapter 12, verse 15, which is the last verse of chapter 12, we see the judgeship of this man named Jephthah. Jephthah. There's no J sound in the Hebrew language. Yiftah is how a good Hebrew Jew would say his name, Yiftah. But that is the judgeship we will see. He doesn't get named until the next chapter, but this is his judgeship. This is the startup for this man named Yiftah to stand to be judged, to be raised up by God to save Israel. Look what it says in verse 6. The sons of Israel again did evil. It's hard to read sometimes. The sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord Yahweh, and they served the Baals, the false gods, the Baalim, the false gods, and the Ashtaroth. This is like husband and wife, by the way. Baal and Ashtoreth, or Asherah, all these different names she has in the different nations. She's his consort. She's the female equivalent to Baal. I won't say husband and wife, but they work together. That's why in the Bible a lot you see Baal and Ashtoreth. They're both fertility gods, and so they're always together, one male, one female. But the sons of Israel have turned away from worshiping the God that exists, the one true God, the Creator, and they're worshiping these false gods. These false gods, the Baals and the Ashtoreth, the gods of Aram. Look at this. He names 7 nations here. You worship the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the sons of Ammon, and the gods of the Philistines. And thus they forsook Yahweh. They abandoned. That's what this word forsook means. They abandoned the worship of Yahweh and did not serve Him. They're not worshiping Yahweh at all at this point. The Bible says here that they have abandoned the worship of Yahweh, and they instead are only worshiping all these false gods. Look at what these names are, though. We're talking about Israelite, national Israel, all over the promised land, everywhere, north, south, east, west, everywhere. Israel is worshiping false gods. Everywhere in the land, Israel is in idolatry. All 12 tribes guilty of idolatry. Aram, if you just go through these names, the gods of Aram, this is Syria, what we would call modern-day Syria, to the northeast of Israel. So on the map, way up here, northeast. Then you have Sidon. Anybody know where Tyre and Sidon are? They're in the northwest. They're on the coast. They're on the Mediterranean coast. So you've got northeast, you've got northwest. God is painting a picture of a map here. Not only inside the land of Canaan, not only the 7 nations that God told Israel to destroy and to not leave anything alive that breathes, not only are those 7 nations their gods being worshipped, but Israel has gone outside the land of Canaan. They've gone looking for gods to worship. They've gone beyond the land of Canaan. That's what God is saying. You've gone to Syria, which is not part of the land of Canaan, and you're worshiping their gods. You've gone to Sidon, which is not part of the land of Canaan, and you're worshiping their gods. You've gone to Moab, which is on the east side of the Jordan River, and you're worshiping their gods. You've gone to the sons of Ammon on the east, south, and east of Israel, and you're worshiping their gods. And you've gone to the Philistines. The Philistines were southern coastal. Today, if you listen to the news and you read about or hear about the Gaza Strip, all that Ashkelon, Ashdod, all those southern Mediterranean sea towns, those were the Philistines. So you've got the northeast, the northwest, the east, the south, the southwest, everywhere in Israel worshiping false gods. It's nationwide. They have abandoned the worship of Yahweh. This is a hard passage to read, but let me read you a few verses from Ezekiel chapter 16. If you ever want to find a chapter where God speaks to Israel and gives Israel His very simple history of their beginning and their end, Ezekiel chapter 16 is the chapter. You got to be a big boy to read it because it is brutal in its language. Brutal. About harlotry, prostitution, about how God names Israel a prostitute wife, a harlot wife. It's brutal. It's bloody. It's nasty. But in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 27, this is what God says to His chosen people, Israel. Behold, therefore, I stretched out my hand against you. I diminished your allotment. I gave you up to the will of those who hate you, the daughters of the Philistines who were ashamed of your lewd behavior. The Philistines were horrible. You were worse. The Philistines were embarrassed by your behavior. You also, this is Yahweh speaking to His people Israel, you also played the harlot or acted the prostitute with the Assyrians. Syria. Here in our list, the gods of Aram. He said, you played the harlot with the Assyrians because you were insatiable. It wasn't enough to have one false lover in our relationship. You wanted multiple false lovers. That's the picture here, and make no mistake. It's about a husband and a wife, God the husband, Israel the wife, and the wife cheating on her husband with an insatiable number of partners. Indeed, he says, you played the harlot with them and still were not satisfied. Moreover, you multiplied your acts of harlotry as far as the land of the traitor, Chaldea, and even then you weren't satisfied. This is Israel not only worshiping the false gods in the land of Canaan, but going outside their borders to Chaldea and Assyria and other places, adopting every false god they could find. How degenerate is your heart, says Yahweh, the Lord God, seeing you do all these things, the deeds of a brazen harlot. You erected your shrine to these false gods at the head of every road. You built your high place in every street. And listen to this. He said, yet you were not like a harlot because you scorned payment. What do we know about a prostitute? They get paid for their services, don't they? I mean, this is harsh language, but this is Bible. You erected your shrine, you built your high place, but you were not like a normal harlot because you didn't want to be paid. You are an adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband. Men make payment to all the harlots, but you made your payments to your lovers. Not only does a man pay a prostitute, what God is telling Israel, you are so lewd and gross that you pay men to come into you. You pay them. These are the words of God to the nation Israel when they are in idolatry. Men make payment to all harlots, but you made your payments to all your lovers, and you hired them to come to you from all around for your harlotry. You are the opposite of other women in harlotry, because no one is solicited to be a harlot, in that you gave payment, but no payment was given you, therefore you are the opposite. A couple more verses. Now then, O harlot, hear the word of Yahweh. You think, why are you reading this? Wait till we get back to Judges chapter 10. You'll know why I'm reading it. He says, "Now then, O harlot, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh Elohim, because your filthiness was poured out and your nakedness uncovered in your harlotry with your lovers and with all your abominable idols." So now we know the lovers are false gods. "And because of the blood of your children which you gave to them," we're talking about human children that were sacrificed to false gods, "surely therefore I will gather all your lovers with whom you took pleasure, all those you loved and all those you hated. I'll gather them from all around against you." What does God use in discipline? The foreign nations. He's going to gather them against Israel, and he says, "And will uncover your nakedness to them that they may see all your nakedness." Now go back to what we see here. 7 nations. Not only in the land of Canaan, but in Aram and Sidon and Moab and Ammon and the Philistines, the land of the Philistines, you abandoned Yahweh and went out and found every false god you could find. You were insatiable in your idolatry. The only God Israel wouldn't worship was the only God that exists, Yahweh. They worshipped everything else you could bring down. Everything that was introduced to them, they engaged in worship. They brought it into their pantheon of false gods. Verse 7. Well, let me say this first. I'm running out of time, but I want to say this. Because we have to take a deep breath, right? We need a little bit of, tell me something good. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant. While Israel is imploding, while Israel is in harsh idolatry, the worst idolatry, God calls them insatiable in their needs to worship false gods. While Israel is as far away from God as you could get, there's always that faithful remnant. Remember the book of Ruth. Remember that during the period of the Judges, somewhere, we don't know where, but somewhere in this 300-year period of rampant idolatry in Israel, the book of Ruth exists. The history of the book of Ruth takes place, where Ruth is a Moabitess. She's from Moab. She's a Gentile. And Ruth has a mother-in-law named Naomi, who's a Jew. And Naomi has been taken out of the land. There's a famine in the land. Her sons have died. Ruth's husband dies. So Naomi decides, I'll go back to my land. I'll go back to Israel. And Ruth says, I'm going with you. Where you go, I go. I'll never separate myself from you. That's loyalty. A Gentile attaches herself to the Jewish God, to the Jewish woman Ruth, and says, I'll worship your God. So Ruth comes into the land of Israel during this period of Judges. We don't know at what point again. And Ruth finds her dead husband's next of kin named Boaz. And what does Boaz do for her? He's a kinsman. He's a relative redeemer. He redeems Ruth. He takes her as his wife. He has a child with Ruth that he names after her dead husband, so that the dead husband's legacy and his family name can continue on, and they continue to have children after that. You know who Boaz and Ruth's great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson, you know who he was? You know what his name is? Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ. During the horribleness of the book of Judges, God is maintaining this righteous remnant that will bow the knee to Him and worship Him and not the false gods. They always exist. And He's preserving this remnant, this little light that's going through the world. And there's this wonderful man, Boaz, this Jew, who takes on the role of a kinsman redeemer for a Gentile woman. And so you see the Jew and the Gentile both in humility worshiping God, and God carrying this Jew and this Gentile through this horrible period of time. When everybody else is insatiable in their lusts for false God worship and idolatry, you've got this remnant. And I pray to God that Gulf Coast Bible Church, no matter what the world does, no matter what America does, that we are a part of that remnant being carried through by God, the light of the world, being carried through to reflect His light in this darkening age. We don't have to fall and be like the world. We're called, as a matter of fact, to hold firm to our confession of faith and to walk as Christians regardless of the cost. We need to be Boaz and we need to be Ruth in the days in which we live. Remember the story of Elijah. Elijah in 1 Kings 17 goes to the northern king Ahab, and he says it's not going to rain for 3 years. And remember, Ahab's wife's name is Jezebel, and she wants Elijah killed. I can't tell the whole story. I hope you know it. But there is a war between Elijah and Yahweh, the one true God, and all the false prophets of Baal and Ashtoreth. Still alive hundreds of years later, in the years of Elijah, a couple hundred, 300 years later, still dealing with the same idolatry, Baal and Ashtoreth. And so Elijah runs for his life, and he's having a conversation with Yahweh, with God. And Elijah tells God, I'm it. I'm the last one. I'm the only one left in Israel who hasn't bowed his knee to Baal. I'm the only non-idolater in the land. True or false? What does God say to Elijah? 1 Kings 19 verse 18, God's response to Elijah, there are 7,000 in Israel. Doesn't sound like a big number, but it's God's number. There are 7,000, yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him, the remnant. So while we go through the book of Judges, yes, it's a downer. The history of Israel is not uplifting. But while we go through this, don't forget that God is having active and intimate relationship with a small number of Israel all the way through. All the way through these, through the book of Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, all the way through to Jesus. There is this remnant that he has intimate relationship with in Israel. Same thing in the church. Same thing in the world today. There are remnant all over the world. There are Christians that aren't idolatrous, that bow the knee to God, that are humble enough to learn the Bible, to want to know what God says and align our lives with what God says. There are still thousands around the world that God is maintaining. So don't lose sight of that. Please don't lose sight of that. Yahweh's response to Israel and all of their insatiable need for false gods. Look at what it says in Judges 10 verse 7. The anger of Yahweh burns. So this is the cycle. The cycle, the first part, Israel goes into idolatry again and does evil, because they worship false gods and abandon worshiping Yahweh. The second part of the cycle, God disciplines Israel by bringing in a foreign nation. The third part of the cycle, Israel will eventually cry uncle and say, God, please save us from this. And the fourth part of the cycle, God raises up a judge, and he does exactly that. We see this complete cycle 6 times in the book of Judges. This is the 5th time we've seen it. So the second part, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel. Of course it did. They abandoned worshiping him. And what did he do? What he's done 4 other times in Jewish history so far in the book of Judges. He sold them not only to one foreign nation this time, but to 2. Harsher discipline. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and into the hands of the sons of Ammon. Remember, the Philistines are Mediterranean coast people, so their attack is coming from the west. The sons of Ammon are from the other side, the Transjordan, the east side of the Jordan, so their attack is coming from the east. Squeezing Israel. Squeezing Israel. 2-front attack. Very quickly, I want to answer the question, because we're about to read about the sons of Ammon. Who are these sons of Ammon? I'm putting this on the board, taking you back into Genesis 19 to show you who they are. Anybody remember who they are? The sons of Ammon without the cheat sheet on the board? Remember, Abraham had a nephew. His name was Lot. Abraham had a couple of brothers. One of his brothers' names, was it Haran? Haran, Abraham's brother Haran, had a son, and his name was Lot. So we're talking about the sons of Lot. Remember what city Lot was in that God destroyed? Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot has to leave the city. The angels come to Lot and say, gather your daughters, gather their husbands, and everybody will be saved, and I'll walk you all out of Sodom and Gomorrah together. But the daughters' husbands wouldn't go. And so they leave Sodom and Gomorrah. And the daughters of Lot are with Lot. Remember, Lot's wife turned around in trying to hold on to that pagan life. She didn't want Sodom and Gomorrah to be destroyed. She liked it there. And so she turns around in this desire to hold on to what she had. She turns into a pillar of salt. So now we're left with one man, Lot, and two daughters. And this is what happens. The two daughters devise a plan. We have no husbands. What are we going to do to continue our father's name? And this is what they did. He said, thus both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. They got daddy drunk, according to the story in Genesis. Oldest daughter went into dad the first night, got pregnant. Next night, got daddy drunk. Younger daughter goes into Lot, her father, and got pregnant. You think, man, I didn't know these things were in the Bible. It's a real book. Thus, both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. Now remember, Lot is Abraham's nephew. He is kin. He's family to Abraham. He called Abraham Uncle Abe. Family. The firstborn bore a son, called his name Moab. Moab, weren't they enemies of Israel? Yes. He's the father of the Moabites to this day. This is family. These are cousins to Israel. Cousins. As for the younger daughter, she also bore a son, and she called his name Ben-Ami, the son of my people. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day. So Lot's children, Moab and Ammon, are cousins to Israel. They're cousins. They're family. And what do we see by the time we get into the book of Judges? Hatred. Absolute hatred. Warfare. The sons of Ammon want Israel dead. So look what it says in verse 8. The sons of Ammon, it says, the cousins to Israel. They afflicted and crushed the sons of Israel that year for 18 years. For 18 years, they afflicted all the sons of Israel who were beyond the Jordan and Gilead in the land of the Amorites. Again, this is east of the Jordan River where the tribes of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh settled. The sons of Ammon, it says, crossed the Jordan. So not only were they fighting on the east side of the river, for 18 years they tormented Israel on the east side of the river, but also they crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim, so that Israel was greatly distressed. So the bulk of their warfare was on the east side of the Jordan River, but they did cross over the river into these three tribal territories on the map. I'll show you the map again. So there we are. What are the tribes? Most of what they're doing is over here east of the river, but they're going across to Judah, Benjamin, and Ephraim. They're crossing over this southern area, crossing the Jordan River. They wreak havoc for 18 years in Israel. 18 years. The interesting thing is that it took 18 years for Israel to cry out to Yahweh. When Midian, the last judge, Gideon is the one who was raised up to kill the Midianites. When Midian was coming in and raiding Israel every year, it only took 7 years for Israel to cry out to Yahweh. They are hardened in their idolatry, hardened in their lack of relationship with Yahweh. 18 years before they'll finally go down to their knees and say, okay, enough. We need to turn back to Yahweh. 18 years it took them, so deeply entrenched in their idolatry. 18 years this time. In verse 10, we'll end in this verse. It says, "Then the sons of Israel cried out to the Lord." And this is what they said. This is the first time and the only time you'll see this in the book of Judges. Israel actually confessed sin to God. They said, "We have sinned against you, Yahweh, for indeed we have abandoned, forsaken our God," the God of Israel, Yahweh. "We've abandoned our God and instead served the Baals, their gods." We've abandoned the worship of our God and adopted the worship of all the false gods of all these nations around us. One more thing to be said, not the last verse. I just want to read these. The Lord said to the sons of Israel, what is the fourth piece to this? Israel does evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord brings a foreign nation to crush Israel, to discipline them, to get them to return to Him. Israel finally will cry uncle. They call on the Lord, and the Lord raises up a judge, right? The fourth part of the cycle, the Lord raises up a judge. What does He do this time? The Lord said to the sons of Israel, "Did I not deliver 7 nations?" He mentions 7 nations, gods, a complete idolatrous situation, 7 being this number of completion. He mentions 7 nations that they're worshiping the gods for or the gods of. And now he mentions 7 nations that He has completely delivered Israel from in the past. I've completely delivered you, yet you are completely in idolatry. The Lord said to the sons of Israel, "Did I not deliver you from the Egyptians, the Amorites, the sons of Ammon and the Philistines?" We're talking about in days past. Verse 12, "Also when the Sidonians and the Amalekites and the Maonites," those are also Midianites, same people, the Maonites, Midianites, "when they oppressed you, what happened? But you cried out to me, and what did I do? I delivered you from their hands. Every time you asked of me, I delivered. Not this time." Look what He says. Verse 13, "You yet in my complete deliverance of you, you have forsaken me, and you've served other gods. Therefore, I will no longer deliver you." You say, wait a minute. I thought you said God made a promise to Israel and God wouldn't break His promise to Israel. And here God is saying, "I will no longer deliver you." It sounds like God's going to let Israel be destroyed by the sons of Ammon, right? No, this is just simply well, let's read the next verse. "Go and cry out to their gods." This is what Yahweh responds to them. When they confess to the Lord, "We've sinned against you, we've forsaken you, please come and save us," He says, "Why don't you go cry out to your gods?" God says, "Go and cry out to the gods which you have chosen. Let them deliver you in your time of distress." So Yahweh tells Israel, why don't you go to your lifeless, dead, false gods? Why do you only want me now? For 18 years you've been worshiping them, even while I've been disciplining you with the sons of Ammon, trying to get you returned to me. Even during all that time you were worshiping those false gods and wouldn't turn to me. But all of a sudden things have gotten too harsh for you and you turn to me. God said, "I'm not here anymore. I'm not going to help." A cliffhanger today. We'll stop right there. God is a promise-keeping God. God will help. God has a stipulation, and the stipulation is you've got to turn back to me and destroy all those idols again. And that's exactly what Israel does. So God will deliver her by raising up this new judge, Yiphtah. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.